Are you serious? Are you serious? Now, everybody calm down, including the leader of Hezbollah. What? That's right. The Hezbollah, the terrorist organization that's entrenched in southern Lebanon, has made a vow. Hezbollah vows. Get this. They vow that the U.S. decision on Jerusalem will mark the beginning of the end for Israel. I repeat, Hezbollah's leader vows that the U.S. decision on Jerusalem and declaring that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, this will mark the beginning of the end for Israel. Matter of fact, tens of thousands of Lebanese and Palestinians attended a Hezbollah rally in Beirut, Lebanon yesterday, where the militant group's leader vowed to return its focus to Israel after years of fighting in Syria's civil war. Matter of fact, he began to push heavy by releasing a video. And in the video, he says, in our trust in God's promise, I'm talking about Hassan Nasrallah, beginning of the end of Israel, the most important reaction on Trump's decision, the most important is on Jerusalem as Israel's capital, is to get back to isolate this entity, talking about Israel. He says, through exerting public pressure, the parliaments, governments, and parties, and social media, he says, protest, and in all means, they want to identify governments in Arab and in Muslim worlds must cut its ties with Israel. This should be the main target, he says. Why? Israel's a sovereign nation and Jerusalem is its capital. And he said in the current stage, and to close the Israeli embassies around the world and all the Arab nations, and to stop all kinds of communications with the Israelis. He went on to say, and normalization with Israel. So Hezbollah is declaring war basically again on Israel, but this time Hezbollah is thousands of people took to the streets, so they're going to start up a new campaign, a new refocus on Israel's a nation, Jerusalem its capital, and the Hezbollah will side with the Muslim Brotherhood, with Hamas. Al-Qaeda will jump in there. We know ISIS is still running around in everybody else's backyard. You still got to deal with all of these. You got the Assad and the Shiite Muslims, the Iranians, all of them hate Israel. Anti-Semitism. This goes all the way back in the Bible. We can go all the way back to Jacob and Esau if you want to, or to Ishmael and Isaac. And you know the descendants of Esau ended up marrying in with the descendants of Ishmael. And this is what formed all of these different Arabic nations. We understand the children of Israel's plight to make it from Abraham all the way to Canaan and everything that the Israeli people went through. But what Hezbollah doesn't understand is, and remember, Islam, look, Muhammad wasn't born until around 606 AD, somewhere in that neighborhood. Islam has only been around for about 1,400 years. So the promises of God made to the children of Israel take us all the way back to the Torah, all the way back into the early days of Genesis, when God spoke these covenants into Abraham. And I must share with you a prophecy alert. Here's what it says in Genesis chapter 15. During a total solar eclipse, and I explained that in my new DVD I came out with this fall called The Total Eclipse of the Sun, S-O-N. All right, it's a powerful DVD. When the sun, this is Genesis chapter 15, verse 12. Check this out. When the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram. And lo, a horror of great darkness fell upon him. And he said unto Abram, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. So your seed, Abraham, that I'm promising you, that through this covenant that God made with Abraham, and God doesn't break covenants. He said, your seed will end up serving 400 years in a country that's not theirs. And of course, that we know that was Egypt. And also that nation, which is Egypt, whom they shall serve, I will judge. And afterward shall they come out with a great substance. So that he's saying to Abraham, your children in the fourth generation will end up in a land that is where they will have to serve in a land that's not theirs 400 years. But when they leave, I will bring them out with a great substance. And what I found what's so amazing about that is that God said they would have a great substance. Well, if you go into the book of Exodus, you'll find out that great substance was the gold, the silver, and the precious stones of Egypt, the jewels of Egypt. Now, it's amazing God told them to spoil Egypt and take all that great wealth with them after being slaves for 400 years. And it's amazing because they were going to take about 600,000 footmen, wives and children. You're looking at 2 million people into a wilderness. And what about water and food? I mean, they took a few victuals that they had on their plate. But I mean, we're talking about sustaining this journey into the wilderness, to the desert. But God said, don't worry about that. Get the jewels, get the gold, get the silver, get the jewels, get the precious stones. Take the wealth of Egypt. You will need it to establish my covenant in the promised land. Because God knew he was going to feed them manna from heaven, and they was going to drink water from a rock. He was miraculously every day going to sustain them. But the wealth would be needed when they established the covenant once they got into the Holy Land. And they would need to build a tabernacle, and they would need to build a temple. And these things would need to be used in the gold to be used for this. Now, this was a tremendous transfer of wealth from the land of Egypt. Now, we understand that more was at stake here. And this is what very important. He says in verse 16, but in the fourth generation they shall come up hither, for the inquiry of the Amorites is not yet full. It shall come to pass that when the sun went down and it was dark during this solar eclipse, behold, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp that passed between those pieces. So they've seen this total solar eclipse in the heavens. We found out that that was on May the 9th, 1533, that this eclipse took place during this covenant promise. In that same day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, unto thy seed have I given this land from the river of Egypt, that would be the Nile, unto the great river, the river Euphrates, the Canaanites, the Kenizzites, the Kadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaims, and the Amorites, and the Canaanites, and the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. Man, that's all the ites. I mean, even some termites. All these giants, all these tribes of Nephilims, all of these giants will be conquered by the children of Israel when they get to the Holy Land. Imagine getting a covenant this profound that is, you're going to be the father of many nations, but the children of Israel will be in the fourth generation, become slaves into a land that's not theirs. They're going to stay there 400 years, but I'm going to bring them out with a great substance, a great blessing. And I'm going to tell you something. I want you to know right now, God is certainly wanting to bless you and your family. And in these last days, we're not leaving here. We're not going to barely crawl into heaven. We're leaving here as a glorious church. We're leaving here without spot or blemish. We're leaving here victorious over the devil. So Hezbollah is threatening the children of Israel. But do they know the prophecies of the Bible? And if they would study the prophecies of the Bible, Hezbollah would not even attempt this. For this will end in utter destruction for them and all of those who come against Israel. Here's what it says in Zechariah. In chapter 12, it says in verse 8, we know that Jerusalem will become this cup of trembling, a burdensome stone for all people. But it says in verse 8, for the Lord seeketh to destroy all nations that come against Israel. And I really feel bad for the EU right now because they made a major mistake. Yesterday, Benjamin Netanyahu came humbly before them, had breakfast with them in Brussels, Belgium, and asked for their support and recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. But all of the EU nations said no. All of them said no. Now, not Great Britain, because Great Britain has pulled out of the EU. But all the rest of them said no, no, no. It isn't good for Germany. This isn't good for France. This isn't good for Belgium. This isn't good for all of the EU nations. It's just not. But worse is what Hezbollah is doing and some of the others that are turning against Israel. But this is part of the rise of the New World Order. This is the beast. You're watching the beast rise. And so you're going to start to hear more and more anti-Semitism, more and more hatred toward Jerusalem, more and more hatred toward Israel. This is all part of the last days playing out right before our very eyes. Are you ready? Have you given your life to Jesus Christ? The signs are everywhere. That solar eclipse in the day of Abraham, well, that solar eclipse that we just saw across America. These are the end time signs of the last days. And you're going to see more and more. Hezbollah, you're going to see more and more of these nations rise up against Israel. It's going to get intense. Intense. These are the last days. Give your life to Jesus Christ. He is coming soon. Don't be left behind. Don't face the wrath of God.